The crowd fell silent as her tired frame appeared on the auction block, a stark contrast to the rowdy atmosphere that had dominated the afternoon in Willow Springs, Colorado. The year was 1878, and the small mining town was experiencing a boom that had drawn fortune seekers and desperate souls alike. Pearl Evans stood with her head bowed, auburn hair falling across her face like a curtain, hiding the tear tracks that streaked her dirt-smudged cheeks. At 22, she had already endured more hardship than most faced in a lifetime. The death of her father had left her with nothing but debts, and now she found herself being sold into indentured servitude to pay what he owed. Next up, we have a fine young woman, healthy and strong, the auctioneer announced, his voice booming across the dusty square. Perfect for household work or mining camp duties. Contracted for 3 years of service to pay off her late father's debts. Bidding starts at $50. Pearl raised her eyes just enough to scan the crowd. Rough-looking men, mostly miners and ranch hands, eyed her with expressions that made her stomach turn. A few prosperous-looking businessmen stood at the edges of the gathering, their cold calculations perhaps even more frightening. Do I hear 50? Yes, 50 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 60? The bids climbed steadily, and Pearl's heart sank with each increase. The higher the price, the more demanding her new master would likely be. $120, called out a man near the front, his voice slurred with whiskey. Pearl recognized him as the owner of the town's largest saloon, a man with a reputation for cruelty toward his employees. $120 going once. $200. A hush fell over the crowd as a tall figure stepped forward. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his Stetson, but Pearl could see a strong jawline covered with several days' worth of stubble. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $200 from Mr. Hayden Jones. Do I hear 220? The saloon owner glared at the newcomer but shook his head. $200 going once, going twice, sold, to Mr. Jones for $200. As the gavel struck the wooden podium, Pearl felt her legs weaken. She had no idea who this man was or what fate awaited her. The auctioneer gestured impatiently for her to step down, but her limbs felt leaden. Then suddenly, her purchaser was there, climbing the steps of the auction block. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a worn leather vest. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her down the steps. Pearl was too shocked to protest. Up close, she could see his face clearly now, weathered by sun and wind, with striking blue eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. He couldn't have been more than 28, though the life of a cowboy aged a man quickly. "Miss Evans, I believe," he said quietly as he set her on her feet once they were clear of the crowd. "My name is Hayden Jones. I own the Double J Ranch about 10 miles outside of town." Pearl struggled to find her voice. "Why did you buy my contract, Mr. Jones?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Let's just say I couldn't stand by and watch what was about to happen. Now come on, my wagon's over here. We've got a ride ahead of us." The wagon was loaded with supplies: flour, coffee, tools, and ammunition. Hayden helped Pearl onto the seat before climbing up himself and taking the reins. "Mr. Jones," Pearl began as they rolled out of town, "I want to know your expectations. I've never been anyone's servant before, but I'm willing to work hard." Hayden's hands tightened on the reins. "First thing you should know is that I don't believe in indentured servitude. It's a sorry excuse for slavery, and I'll have no part in it." Pearl stared at him in confusion. "Then why did you pay for my contract?" "Because I couldn't leave you to the likes of McCready or any of the others bidding on you." He glanced at her briefly. "The contract will be torn up when we reach my ranch. You're free to stay and work with fair wages or go wherever you please." Pearl could hardly believe what she was hearing. "But you paid $200. Money comes and goes, Miss Evans. A person's freedom is worth more." They traveled in silence for a while, Pearl stealing glances at the man beside her. His profile was strong, his posture straight despite the obvious weariness in his eyes. He had the calloused hands of a man who worked for everything he had. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" She finally asked. Hayden was quiet for so long that Pearl thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, 4 years ago, my sister found herself in a similar situation back east. No one stepped forward to help her. His jaw tightened. She didn't survive her first year of service. Pearl felt a chill despite the warm spring day. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, just make something of the chance you're getting. As they approached the Double J Ranch, Pearl was surprised by its size. It wasn't the largest spread she'd ever seen, but it was well maintained with a handsome 2-story house, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. A bunkhouse stood a short distance from the main house and smoke curled from its chimney. It's beautiful, she said honestly. Hayden's expression softened. Been building it up for 6 years now, started with nothing but a run-down cabin and 50 head of cattle. You've done well for yourself. We manage. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Mrs. Fletcher runs the household, she'll get you settled. As if on cue, a plump woman in her 50s emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She eyed Pearl with open curiosity. Mrs. Fletcher, this is Pearl Evans. She'll be staying with us for a while. The housekeeper's eyebrows rose, but she merely nodded. Welcome, Miss Evans. Come inside and I'll show you to a room. You look like you could use a hot bath and a decent meal. Pearl hesitated, looking back at Hayden, who was already unloading the wagon. Thank you, Mr. Jones. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness. He paused, a sack of flour balanced on his shoulder. There's no debt, Miss Evans. Remember that. That night, after the first real bath she'd had in weeks and wearing a borrowed nightgown that was several sizes too large, Pearl lay in a comfortable bed and stared at the ceiling. The events of the day seemed like a dream. She had gone from facing a life of servitude to being offered freedom and a job in the span of hours. She thought of Hayden Jones, with his quiet strength and unexpected kindness. There was a sadness in him, a darkness behind those blue eyes that spoke of past pain. Pearl knew something about pain herself. Her father had been a dreamer, always chasing the next big strike, dragging her from one mining town to another across the West. When consumption finally took him, all he left her was a mountain of debt and broken promises. Pearl closed her eyes, determined to make the most of this unexpected chance. Whatever Mr. Jones's reasons for helping her, she would prove worthy of his investment. The next morning, Pearl awoke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains. For a moment, she was disoriented, until the memories of the previous day came flooding back. She dressed quickly in the simple cotton dress Mrs. Fletcher had provided and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Mrs. Fletcher stood at the stove, her gray hair neatly pinned in a bun. Good morning, Miss Evans. Sleep well. Better than I have in months, Pearl admitted. What can I do to help? Mrs. Fletcher smiled approvingly. You can set the table. The men will be in from morning chores soon, hungry as bears. Pearl was just placing the last plate when the back door opened and several men filed in. Hayden came last, his shirt damp with sweat, hat in hand. Morning, he said, nodding to Pearl. Hope you slept well. Very well, thank you. He introduced her to the ranch hands, 4 men who lived in the bunkhouse and helped run the operation. They were a diverse group. Patrick, an older Irishman with twinkling eyes, Miguel, a young Mexican vaquero, Caleb, a former slave from Georgia, and Thomas, a quiet man about Hayden's age who seemed to be his right-hand man. Miss Evans will be staying with us for a while, Hayden told them. She'll be helping Mrs. Fletcher with the house. The men were polite, if curious, and conversation flowed easily around the table. Pearl learned that the Double J ran about 500 head of cattle with plans to expand. They bred horses on the side, and Hayden had a reputation for training some of the finest cutting horses in the territory. After breakfast, Hayden asked Pearl to join him in his office, a small room off the main parlor with a desk covered in papers and ledgers. I meant what I said yesterday, he began, opening a drawer and pulling out a folded document. This is your contract of indenture. As far as I'm concerned, it's worthless. He tore it in half, then in quarters, and dropped the pieces into the wastebasket. Pearl watched, a lump forming in her throat. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything." Hayden leaned against the desk. "Now, as for your position here, Mrs. Fletcher could use the help, and I'm willing to pay $12 a month plus room and board." "It's honest work, but not easy." "That's more than fair," Pearl said, amazed at his generosity. "A female domestic worker typically earned far less." "Good. We'll try it for a month, see how it suits you." He paused. "I should tell you, I'm not always an easy man to work for. I expect things done right, and I don't have patience for excuses." Pearl met his gaze steadily. "I don't make excuses, Mr. Jones. I do my best, and if I fail, I learn from it." Something flickered in his eyes, approval, perhaps. "Then we'll get along fine." The days settled into a rhythm. Pearl rose early to help Mrs. Fletcher prepare breakfast, then spent the morning cleaning, washing, or mending. The afternoons were often devoted to the vegetable garden behind the house or preserving food for the winter months ahead. It was hard work but satisfying, and for the first time in years, Pearl felt secure. She saw Hayden mainly at mealtimes. He was up before dawn and often worked until sunset, managing the ranch with tireless energy. He wasn't a talkative man, but when he did speak, people listened. His men respected him, Pearl noticed, not out of fear but because he worked harder than any of them and never asked someone to do something he wouldn't do himself. As spring turned to summer, Pearl found herself watching for him, listening for his voice, aware of his presence in a way that both confused and excited her. She told herself it was merely gratitude, but deep down, she knew it was more. One evening in late June, Pearl was sitting on the front porch, shelling peas for the next day's dinner when Hayden joined her. He sat in the chair beside her, stretching his long legs out before him. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, though he'd already settled in. "It's your porch," Pearl replied with a smile. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic clicking of peas dropping into the bowl and the distant lowing of cattle. "You're doing well here," Hayden said finally. "Mrs. Fletcher says you're the best help she's ever had." Pearl felt a flush of pleasure. "She's been kind to me, everyone has. It's not kindness, you've earned your place." He took off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. "The men have noticed it too. Thomas says you're the first woman to set foot on this ranch who didn't complain about the dust or the isolation." Pearl laughed softly. "I spent most of my life in mining camps. This is paradise by comparison." Hayden turned to look at her directly. "Tell me about your life before, if you don't mind." So Pearl told him about her father, a charming dreamer who had never struck it rich, but never stopped believing the next big strike was just around the corner. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Pearl was 14, and about the years that followed, moving from camp to camp, taking in laundry or cooking for miners to help make ends meet. "When Pa died, I discovered he'd borrowed money from half the businessmen in Willow Springs," she concluded. "I couldn't pay it back, so they took everything we had and still said I owed more. That's when they drew up the indenture contract." Hayden's face had darkened. "That's not right." "Not legal either," Pearl shrugged. "What choice did I have? I was alone, with no family and no means to fight them." "You're not alone now," Hayden said, his voice low and intense. Their eyes met and something passed between them, an understanding that neither was ready to name. Pearl looked away first, her heart racing. "No," she agreed softly. "I'm not alone now." The next day Hayden rode to town with Thomas, returning late in the evening. Pearl had already gone to bed when a knock came at her door. "Pearl, are you awake?" It was Mrs. Fletcher. Pearl lit the lamp beside her bed. "Yes, come in." The housekeeper entered, carrying a large bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Jones brought this back from town, said it was for you." Curious, Pearl unwrapped the bundle to find beautiful calico prints in blues and greens, enough for several dresses along with thread, buttons, and trimmings. "Oh my," she breathed, running her fingers over the material. Mrs. Fletcher smiled knowingly. He said your old dress was getting too worn for decent wear, and you needed something proper. Pearl felt tears spring to her eyes. No one had given her such a thoughtful gift in years. The next morning, she waited for Hayden to come in for breakfast, anxious to thank him, but Mrs. Fletcher informed her that he and some of the hands had ridden out before dawn to check on a herd in the north pasture and wouldn't be back until evening. Pearl spent the day cutting patterns and beginning work on a new dress, her mind constantly drifting to Hayden. Why had he done this for her? Was it merely the kindness of an employer, or was there more to it? 3 days passed before Hayden returned, looking tired and trail-worn. Pearl had finished one dress by then and wore it to serve dinner that night. It was a simple design, but the blue calico brought out the green in her eyes, and she had taken special care with the fit. When she entered the dining room with a platter of roast beef, Hayden looked up and his expression changed, softening in a way that made Pearl's breath catch. "That's a fine dress," he said simply. "Thank you for the fabric," Pearl replied. "It was too generous." Hayden shook his head slightly. "It suits you." That night, Pearl lay awake, replaying that moment the way his eyes had lingered on her. Was she foolish to hope that he might feel something for her beyond the obligation of an employer? And even if he did, what future could there be for them? She was a penniless woman with nothing to offer but herself. July brought scorching heat and the annual cattle drive to sell the spring calves. Hayden and most of the men would be gone for nearly 3 weeks, leaving only Thomas and Mrs. Fletcher at the ranch with Pearl. The night before they were to leave, Pearl found Hayden in the barn, checking the saddles and gear for the journey. She carried a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I brought you something for the trail," she said, holding it out. Hayden looked surprised but accepted the package, unwrapping it to reveal a new shirt, carefully sewn from some of the fabric he had given her. "I noticed your old one was nearly worn through at the elbows," Pearl explained. Suddenly shy, Hayden ran his fingers over the neat stitching. "This is fine work, Pearl, thank you." "It's nothing compared to what you've done for me," she said softly. Hayden set the shirt aside and stepped closer. In the dim light of the barn, his face was shadowed, but Pearl could feel the intensity of his gaze. "I didn't do it to create a debt," he said. "I hope you know that." "I do," Pearl assured him, "but gratitude isn't the same as debt." Hayden reached out slowly as if giving her time to step away and touched her cheek with rough fingertips. "And is gratitude all you feel?" Pearl's heart hammered in her chest. "No," she whispered, "not just gratitude." For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he let his hand fall away. "I'll be back in 3 weeks," he said, his voice rough. "We'll talk then." Pearl nodded, disappointment and anticipation warring within her. "I'll be here." The days of Hayden's absence dragged by. Pearl threw herself into her work, helping Thomas with the garden and learning to ride one of the gentler horses so she could check on the chickens that often wandered far from the coop. In the evenings, she sewed by lamplight, making herself another dress and working on shirts for Hayden. 2 weeks into the cattle drive, trouble came to the Double J. Pearl was hanging laundry when she heard riders approaching. Thomas stepped out of the barn, rifle in hand, as 3 men reined up in the yard. Pearl recognized one immediately: McCready, the saloon owner who had bid on her at the auction. His small eyes narrowed when he saw her. Well, well, if it isn't Jones's little purchase," he sneered. "Looks like he's got you playing house." Thomas moved to stand between Pearl and the visitors. "State your business, McCready." "Just being neighborly," the man replied with a false smile. "Heard Jones was away driving cattle, thought I'd check if everything was secure here." His eyes lingered on Pearl in a way that made her skin crawl. "Everything's fine," Thomas said curtly. "You can be on your way." McCready dismounted instead, his companions following suit. "Now that's not very hospitable, we've ridden a long way." Mrs. Fletcher appeared on the porch, a shotgun in her hands. "This is private property, Mr. McCready. You're not welcome here." McCready's face darkened. "You think a woman and an old man can order me off? I don't take kindly to threats." "Then you won't like what happens next," came a new voice. Pearl turned to see Hayden riding into the yard, followed by Patrick and Miguel. His face was grim, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. McCready paled slightly but tried to maintain his bravado. "Jones, didn't expect you back so soon." "Evidently." Hayden dismounted, his movements deliberate. "You're trespassing, McCready. Just paying a social call." "You're not welcome on my land," Hayden said, each word precise and cold. "Now get on your horses and ride out, or I'll have my men escort you to the property line. And I promise you won't enjoy the journey." For a tense moment, Pearl thought McCready might refuse, but something in Hayden's stance, the coiled readiness, the absolute certainty, must have convinced him it wasn't worth the risk. "Another time, then," McCready said with a final malevolent glance at Pearl before mounting his horse. "There won't be another time," Hayden replied. "If I see you on my land again, I won't bother with warnings." They watched in silence as the three men rode away. When they were out of sight, Hayden turned to Pearl, concern etching his features. "Are you all right? Did they threaten you?" "I'm fine," she assured him. "Thomas and Mrs. Fletcher had the situation in hand." Hayden nodded, but his jaw remained tight. "McCready's been causing trouble in town. I heard about it during the drive and decided to come back early." He looked at Thomas. "Post 2 men on watch tonight, just in case." That evening, after the hands had been fed and the house secured, Pearl found Hayden on the porch, staring out at the darkening landscape. "You're back early," she said, settling into the chair beside him. The drive went faster than expected. "Good prices this year," he glanced at her. "But that's not why I rushed back." Pearl waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "In town, I heard McCready bragging in the saloon about how he was going to pay a visit to the Double J while I was away." Hayden's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "He still thinks he has some claim on you, Pearl." "He doesn't," she said firmly. "No one does." "I know that." Hayden turned to face her fully. "But I also know he's dangerous. He doesn't like being outbid or outplayed." "What will he do?" "Nothing if he's smart." Hayden's expression was hard. "But men like McCready aren't known for their intelligence." They sat in silence for a while, the tension of the day slowly ebbing away. Finally, Hayden spoke again, his voice softer. "When I heard him talking about coming here about you, I realized something." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I realized that the thought of anyone harming you was unbearable to me." Pearl's heart quickened. "Hayden, let me finish," he said gently. "When I bought your contract that day, I told myself it was because of my sister, because I couldn't stand by and watch another woman suffer that fate. And that was part of it. But even then, there was something about you, Pearl. Something that called to me." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. "These past months, watching you build a place for yourself here, seeing your strength and your kindness, I've come to care for you in a way I never expected." Pearl felt tears welling in her eyes. "I've come to care for you too," she whispered. "More than I should, perhaps." "Why shouldn't you?" Hayden's blue eyes were intense in the fading light. "Because I'm your employee. Because I came to you with nothing, not even my freedom." "Your freedom was never mine to give or take," Hayden said firmly. "And as for being my employee, that can change if you want it to." Pearl's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Hayden stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "I'm saying that I love you, Pearl Evans. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you on that auction block, too proud to beg despite your circumstances." He cupped her face in his hands. "I don't want to be your employer. I want to be your partner, your husband, if you'll have me." Pearl felt as if her heart might burst. "Are you certain? I have nothing to bring to a marriage." "You have everything I need," Hayden said simply. "Courage, strength, kindness. The rest is just details." And then he was kissing her, his lips warm and firm against hers, his arms drawing her close. Pearl melted into him, all doubts washing away in the tide of emotion that swept through her. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Pearl smiled up at him. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, Hayden Jones." The days that followed were a whirlwind of happiness and planning. News of their engagement spread quickly, and Mrs. Fletcher took charge of preparing for a September wedding. Pearl wrote to her father's sister in Denver, the only family she had left, inviting her to the ceremony. True to his nature, Macready made one final attempt to cause trouble. 2 weeks before the wedding, he filed a legal challenge to Pearl's freedom, claiming that her indenture contract had been sold under false pretenses, and that he had been denied his rightful bid. Hayden rode into town immediately and returned with the county judge, who reviewed the torn pieces of Pearl's contract that Hayden had kept as evidence of its nullification. The judge ruled firmly that Pearl was a free woman and that Macready's claim was without merit. Furthermore, the judge added sternly, I find the original indenture contract to have been drawn up under dubious circumstances. Mr. Macready, if you pursue this matter further, I may be inclined to investigate the business practices of several Willow Springs merchants. Macready slunk away, his reputation in town further damaged by the incident. Hayden suggested they post guards for the wedding, but Pearl disagreed. He's a coward at heart, she said, and now everyone knows it. He won't risk public humiliation again. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, a perfect September morning. Pearl wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her make, with lace trim sent by her aunt from Denver. Hayden waited for her in the garden behind the house, where an arbor had been constructed and decorated with late-blooming wildflowers. As Pearl walked toward him on Thomas's arm, she thought back to that terrible day on the auction block, how certain she had been that her life was over. Instead, it had been just beginning. Hayden's face as he watched her approach was a mixture of awe and joy that Pearl knew she would remember for the rest of her life. When the preacher asked who gave this woman in marriage, Thomas answered proudly, "She gives herself with the blessing of her friends." The vows were simple, the promises heartfelt. Hayden's voice was steady as he pledged to love, honor, and cherish her for all the days of his life. Pearl's vision blurred with tears as she made the same promises in return. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Hayden drew her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that belied his strength. The small gathering of friends and ranch hands erupted in cheers and applause. That evening, after the celebrations had wound down and the last guests had departed, Hayden led Pearl up to their bedroom, now theirs together. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a small wooden box from a drawer. He handed it to Pearl, a hint of nervousness in his expression. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a gold locket on a delicate chain. Pearl opened it to find a tiny photograph of Hayden on one side. "The other side is for our first child," he explained softly. "When the time comes." Pearl closed the locket and pressed it to her heart. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Everything is perfect." Hayden drew her into his arms. "Not everything," he murmured against her hair. "But we'll face the imperfect parts together." "Together," Pearl agreed, raising her face for his kiss. "Always together." 5 years later, Pearl stood on the porch of the Double J, watching as Hayden taught their 3-year-old daughter, Hannah, to ride her first pony. Their infant son, Henry, slept peacefully in her arms, his small hand curled around her finger. The ranch had prospered, expanding to nearly twice its original size. The house had grown too, with new rooms added for the children and improvements that made it one of the finest homes in the county. Pearl thought sometimes of that auction block, of how close she had come to a very different life. She thought of Hayden, stepping forward when no one else would, offering not just freedom but dignity. "Mama, look," Hannah called, her face alight with pride as she guided her pony in a small circle. "I'm riding all by myself, I see, sweetheart." "You're doing wonderfully," Pearl called back. Hayden looked up at her, his smile as warm and true as it had been on their wedding day. In his eyes, Pearl saw the same love that had carried her down from that auction block and into a life she could never have imagined, a life built on respect, partnership, and an enduring love that grew stronger with each passing day. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Pearl shifted her sleeping son in her arms and thought, not for the first time, that some auctions had happier endings than others.